The fallout from Britain's decision to leave the European Union continues. What are the major political and economic implications for the UK and the European Union? Hello, I'm Nathan King, and this is The Heat. Just 1 week after voters in the United Kingdom opted by a small margin to leave the EU, the country is deeply divided over its future, and there are serious questions about Britain's economy. Following the vote, there was a dramatic drop in the value of the pound against the dollar. Now many are worried about an economic recession. Meanwhile, British Prime Minister David Cameron told leaders at a meeting of the European Council in Brussels this week the concerns of immigration were a key factor in his country's decision to vote for an exit, or Brexit, from the EU. But he also insisted that the UK still wants to maintain a good relationship with other EU member states.
While we're leaving the European Union, we mustn't be turning our backs on Europe. These countries are our neighbours, our friends, our allies, our partners, and I very much hope we'll seek the closest possible relationship in terms of trade and cooperation and security, because that is good for us and that is good for them.
Still, the reaction from European leaders has not been very sympathetic. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has dismissed any notion the UK might somehow not take the formal step of actually leaving the EU. She said, quote, "I do not see any possibility to reverse this decision. It is not the hour for wishful thinking." Meanwhile, the Scots, who voted overwhelmingly to remain in Europe, have made it clear that they may press again for independence from the United Kingdom.
Mr. Speaker, let me tell this House and our friends across Europe, we have no intention whatsoever of seeing Scotland taken out of Europe. That would be totally democratically unacceptable. We are a European country and we will stay a European country. And if that means we have to have an independence referendum to protect Scotland's place, then so be it.
And to further underline Scottish concerns, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, also visited Brussels this week to talk about her country's future relationship with the EU. For more, I'm joined now from London by John Petley. He is with the Campaign for an Independent Britain. Also with us from London via Skype is journalist Hugo Dixon. He's the author of The In-Out Question, Why Britain Should Stay in the EU and Fight to Make It Better. Welcome both to the show. Obviously, John, let's start with you. Congratulations, I suppose. Now that there's a big win for leave, what are you going to do with it?
Well, I think what we're going to do with it, I think it's not really a case of what the politicians are going to do with it. We've got to make it work. The debate had a lot of shortcomings, I think, on both sides, and a lot of people, in fact, I'd say even quite a lot of senior people on the Leave side, hadn't really thought what comes next.
Yes, there seems to be no
plan.
plan.
Lack of an exit strategy. There have been one or two plans published, and I know that the Civil Service have been looking at one or two ideas, but not much came across from particularly the big names on the Leave side, which was a concern for me, and I think is a concern for quite a lot of people up and down the country.
Sorry, I want to go to Hugo. So, Hugo, the Leave campaign won quite substantially, yet the day after...
It didn't win substantially. It was 51.9 versus 48.1. I mean, that is it's a clear win, but not a substantial one.
And a surprising win, though. The markets had it going the other way. So they won, but immediately afterwards seemed to be a lot of backpedaling and a sort of lot of surprise, frankly, from some politicians that they'd actually won and what to do next. Is that the climate we're still in?
We don't have a plan. They don't have a plan. And they're going to need to figure out a plan. But of course, they have to figure out who's going to be the Prime Minister. And it's quite possible that it won't be one of the people who campaigned for leave. It looks like the two front runners are going to be Michael Gove, who indeed was campaigning for leave, and Theresa May, who was campaigning for remain. My gut feeling is that Theresa May will actually be the Prime Minister, and she said that she will develop a plan over the next few weeks and months, and only when she's ready with a plan will she institute formal divorce negotiations with the European Union. So she said, and that wouldn't be before the end of the year. So clearly there isn't a plan. There needs to be a plan. It's a bit worrying that there isn't a plan. But frankly, this is something that we were warning throughout, that there was no plan. Now, we all have to make the best of a bad job. I think it will be a fairly bad job, but I think we need to seek to minimize the economic damage that is probably going to be caused by this vote. And we also need to make sure that Britain maintains as good relations with the EU as possible, not just in trade, but also on critical things like fighting terrorism, standing up to Vladimir Putin, and fighting global warming. These are all things that we are going to be better able to do if we work closely with the rest of the EU, or with the EU as and when we leave the EU, and of course with other countries such as America. These are very important that we do not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I want to go to you, John, and pick up on that. Obviously, plans still being developed, but we have this vacuum, if you like, politically, at least until it looks like October. Then, of course, the UK may invoke Article 50 up to 2 years of negotiations with the EU. Meanwhile, we have the Europeans going, let's hurry this up because there's so much uncertainty while Britain still stays in and isn't out yet. I mean, this has really potential ramifications for instability in the UK and across Europe, doesn't it?
I think it does. I think we have to be moving as quickly as we can towards an exit plan. I mean, I would see us gravitating almost by default towards a stage withdrawal where our first port of call, as you might say, is to rejoin the European Free Trade Association and access the single market via the European Economic Area Agreement, which I think will allay a lot of the business fears. It's obviously raises the issue of immigration. I mean, that's been really the big problem that the Leave people have faced. On the one hand, they've heard these concerns from business. They've obviously been saying, we want to have stability, we don't want to have any sort of economic meltdown. But on the other hand, they've recognised the potency of the whole immigration issue, that a lot of people were really voting out with that being their number one issue. I believe it was something like 38% of Leave voters. And it's been a difficult juggling act for them. And I think that possibly the EEA offers a way forward in as much as there are certain restrictions that could be placed on immigration, not as great as obviously some Leavers would like, but at the same time that crucial access to the single market can be maintained.
Hugo Dixon, are the British living in a fantasy land to basically say that it thinks it can keep the economic agreements it has with the EU at the moment without having the free movement of workers in Europe, which has led to some of the questions about immigration?
I think that that's going to be impossible to have full access to the single market without maintaining free movement for EU citizens to come to the UK. Now, if we say we're prepared to have partial access for EU citizens to come to the UK, I think we probably can get partial access to the EU single market. And so that will be what the negotiation is ultimately about. How much access are we going to allow for their citizens to come here in return for how much access for our goods and services are they going to allow to their single market? And it's very difficult to know exactly how that trade-off will be struck. I think that we will be damaged in the process, but I certainly would agree with John that if we can do a situation like the one that Norway has, which has got pretty much full access to the single market, that would be the least bad option. But I think that that's going to be extremely hard to sell to the people who voted with John for leaving the EU, because, as he said, a large majority of them were doing this because they were opposed to immigration. I just want to say one other thing, which is that although I agree with John that it would be good to do this quickly, it's not going to happen quickly. Right. There is, in my view, no way that we can engage in substantial negotiations with the rest of the EU until at least September of next year. September 2017. And the reason for that is as follows. If we're not going to even trigger these divorce proceedings until the end of the year, you're running straight into the French presidential elections, which are next spring. Then after that, you're running straight into the German general election, which is next autumn. It is only after those big electoral contests are over that you are likely to get the two other major European powers seriously willing to make concessions to the British. So I'm afraid we're actually talking for at least 15 months of radical uncertainty, which will be bad for our economy and bad for the European economy and potentially bad for the global economy.
Hugo, I'm glad you brought up the other European powers, because there is a deep sense of scepticism on the continent as well, as you know. I just want to play you Nigel Farage in front of the European Parliament earlier this week.
The main reason the United Kingdom voted the way that it did is you have, by stealth, by deception, without ever telling the truth to the British or the rest of the peoples of Europe, you have imposed upon them a political union.
John Petley, obviously Nigel Farage was someone talking themselves out of a job there, obviously. Is there a deep-seated feeling across Europe that the Leave campaign in Britain has legs, and domestic opinion in France and other places are following along?
I think it could trigger demands for referendums elsewhere. I mean, as Hugo was saying, there's so much hanging on the elections coming up next year, particularly in France. I mean, we know that Marine Le Pen is keen to encourage a referendum in France. I don't know how well she's going to do. I think that obviously the fallout from what's happened in the UK is going to take a long time, really, to stop reverberating around Europe. Whether it's going to lead to an overwhelming desire in France for something similar, I wouldn't like to say. I certainly think it's possible. Judging from one poll I looked at recently, it seems that the French are even unhappier about their membership of the EU than we are over here. So I certainly think it's possible. And again, in Germany, I don't see a demand for referendum over there, but Frau Merkel, who seemed to have certainly a year or so ago the next term in the bag, I don't think we can necessarily guarantee that she's the person that our negotiators will be dealing with by the end of 2017. Hugo's quite right. I mean, much as it would be good to trigger Article 50, those uncertainties on the continent do suggest that the 2-year period for Article 50 to complete the negotiations is almost certainly going to have to be extended.
And Hugo, we have this also domestic situation in the UK, where, of course, Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain and straight away came out, talked about the possibility of another referendum and wanting to stay in Europe as well, and is starting at least preliminary discussions. That, of course, could slow things up and complicate things and perhaps lead to the dissolution of the United Kingdom.
It could indeed, and that was one of the things that people on my side of the campaign were warning about, although I must say that my fellow people on the Remain side didn't make nearly as much of that risk as they should have. But I think it's a very, very big risk, which is also why I think the least bad option is to go for remaining in the single market, even if we're not in the EU.
John, obviously a wake-up call for Europe as well, one of the largest economies voting to leave. What sort of reforms can you see coming out of the European Union for the remaining members?
That's a difficult one. I mean, on the one hand, the next stage was always closer integration within the Eurozone, such as consolidation of fiscal powers at the Eurozone level. On the other hand, I think that the fact that the EU has had such a shock in one of its largest members leaving may result in quite a bit of resistance to the onward march towards ever closer union. I don't honestly know how it's going to play out at this stage. I also wonder whether the other big crisis that the EU is facing as a whole, which is the migration crisis, quite where that's going to lead. Are there going to be demands for Schengen to be modified, or even one or two nations to say we're just not going to be part of it anymore? I think it's facing
borders, yes.
These two, yes, the open border crisis. I think that, to be honest, the idea of actually pursuing serious reform is going to be somewhat compromised by really the existential crisis that Brexit plus the influx of refugees has created for us. It's going to be a case of firefighting and trying to work out what to do next, rather than, I think, having the resources to engage in lots of serious reform. I hope that it doesn't get overwhelmed by a big crisis. I would hate to see the sort of unrest that, you know, although I disagreed with the way it was done, the sentiment behind setting up the EU to try and prevent that sort of bloodshed that was a feature of the 20th century. I hope it doesn't actually disintegrate into that sort of anarchy. I really don't.
Hugo, one last point. What's the reputational damage for the United Kingdom around the world from Brexit?
I think it clearly damages our influence, but we have to pick ourselves up and make the best out of a bad job. And Britain is still an important economy. It still has centuries of diplomatic expertise. It still has its permanent seat on the UN Security Council. It still has important armed forces, important intelligence agencies. We won't have as much influence because we'll no longer be one of the leaders of Europe, and we'll have to lead just on the basis of Britain alone rather than Britain leading Europe, leading the world. But, so we've taken a big knock, but I hope it won't be, I don't think on its own it will be a disastrous knock. It will only be disastrous, in my view, if by leaving the EU, we trigger the further disintegration of the whole EU. And then, at the moment, we're in a glorious position. We have a buffer zone, 1,000 miles in every direction of peace and stability. And that is basically the EU. If that EU disintegrates at the same time that North Africa and the Middle East are boiling cauldrons, millions of people are on the move, Vladimir Putin is flexing his muscles, then that will be very bad for us. But provided the rest of the EU holds together, it won't be disastrous, but we just won't have as much influence as we had.
John Pettley, just quickly, do you think that the United Kingdom could hold its clout in a world that's ever more globalised and forming into regional blocs?
Oh, I think so. I mean, one comment I remember David Cameron making was about being on the top tables. Well, as far as trade is concerned, we are currently represented by the EU on quite a number of top tables. Once we leave, we'll have our own representatives, which will certainly give us a lot of clout in framing things like the increasingly global rules for trade. I think it'll be good. The City of London, yes, parts of it have taken a bit of a knock, but we still are a world leader in financial services. That's going to continue. We are very favourably placed geographically, being midway between the Asian and the American time zones. That's not going to change. We've always been a great trading nation. We've been a very open economy. That's going to continue. Our armed forces are still very highly regarded. Our intelligence, it's the Anglophone nations that provide the cornerstone of much global intelligence gathering. All those things are going to continue. I believe we're going to continue to be a nation that really does punch above its weight, in fact, right across the world. I think that in many ways we're going to have greater opportunities as a result of not being tied to a project that we've only ever really, most of us, been at best half committed to.
Well, on that optimistic note and a pessimistic week, we'll have to end it. John Pettley, thank you very much for joining us, and Hugo Dixon as well. We'll take a short break. When we come back, we will talk to a former Irish Prime Minister who also served as the EU ambassador to the United States. Please stay with us on The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. We are talking about Britain's decision last week to leave the European Union. Joining me now from Dublin is the former Irish Prime Minister, John Bruton. He is also a former EU ambassador to the United States. Thanks so much for joining us. You're perhaps pleased to take the pulse of the European Union. How are European Union leaders feeling after this vote?
I think they're very disappointed because the European Union has been in existence for the last 70 years and we have a long number of countries who have joined or who want to join, and this is the first occasion that any country has chosen to leave. But the European Union works on the basis that a country is free to leave, but we're disappointed that they're leaving.
And what's the mood like in sort of entertaining all of the UK's desires to have all the economic benefits of trading with the richest trading bloc in the world, but none of the social or immigration problems that, of course, ignited this campaign?
Well, it's been made clear to the United Kingdom from the very beginning that freedom of movement of people went alongside freedom of movement of capital and money, that you couldn't have one without the other. And there's no way that the European Union is going to concede on that point.
There also must be a feeling of setting an example. The mood in the European Union is not great. and if someone leaves, you can't make the terms too easy on them, because that could, of course, lead to other countries wanting to do the same, correct?
I wouldn't really look at it that way. Basically, we have what they call 4 freedoms in the European Union: freedom of movement of people, of goods, and of services. And these go together. You can't really have one without the other. And it's basically to maintain that principle that the European Union is taking the stand that it is taking. It's not to make life particularly difficult for the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom is a European country and we're going to be trading with it somehow or other anyway. We'd prefer to be trading with it on the basis where we are working with them to make joint rules that apply to all of us. But if they don't want to apply those rules, they're obviously going to lose some of the access that they would have to the European market if they did apply them. But it is going to involve substantial costs, this decision. Substantial costs for Britain, but also substantial costs for the rest of Europe, including, of course, particularly Ireland, which has more trade and interchange with Britain than any other European Union country does.
What costs do you see down the road?
Well, charging tariffs on British goods and services, Britain not being able to sell the financial services of London throughout the European Union. If, as a member of the European Union, services provided in London or from London to the rest of Europe have a sort of EU passport for those services to be availed of in the rest of the European Union, because we are satisfied about the rules being applied in the United Kingdom as a member of the European Union. But as soon as the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, then we don't recognise and won't be able to recognise the adequacy of UK rules, so they will not be able to sell their services in the rest of Europe. That will be a major loss for London, an avoidable loss, a loss which was drawn to the attention of the British people before they voted, but they chose for other reasons to ignore that.
And what about the speed of this UK exit from Europe? They have to yet invoke Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which of course allows up for 2 years, although it's never been used before. Yet there seems to be this leadership vacuum in the UK, with both major parties looking like they may lose their leaders' elections. They're not in a hurry to invoke this. This could create instability, correct, in Europe for some time to come, and European leaders seem to want to get on with this.
Well, I think if the United Kingdom has to go, it doesn't join the European Economic Area, which is a ready-made thing they could join along with Norway and Iceland and a few other countries, which would and could be done relatively quickly. If they don't decide to do that, we're going to have perhaps 9 years or more of negotiation about an agreement between the UK.
You could see a
and
decade
the European
nearly?
Union. So we could.
You could see a
Oh yes, absolutely.
Why?
If you look at the Canadian agreement, well, the Canadian agreement took 7 years to negotiate, and it hasn't even been ratified yet, because it has to be ratified in every country. If we have to have an agreement with Britain, that's going to take an awful lot longer than a Canadian agreement, because the number of subjects to be covered in an agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union will be much more. And there will be a number of interests in every one of the other countries that will have to be taken care of. And just one of them, a small country like Malta, could be enough to stop the agreement going into effect at the end of the 9 or 10 years it will take to negotiate it. So I think the issue of whether they put in the Article 50 notice next month or 3 months from now or a longer period, that's small in terms of the uncertainty it generates than the uncertainty that has been generated by the original decision that the people took to leave.
So you predict a potential a decade of uncertainty, and of course there's constitutional uncertainty in the United Kingdom as well, with Scotland voting to remain, and very eager, it seems, from the Scottish National Party to stay in the European Union, or at least have what they have now in terms of trade.
Yes, indeed, and this points up the difference between the United Kingdom Union and the European Union. In the European Union, every one of the 27 countries would have to agree to any major decision like this. But in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, Scotland can be literally pulled out of the European Union against its wishes, because there are more votes in England than there are in Scotland.
And let's talk about where you are, the island of Ireland. in Northern Ireland, which as part of the EU and an open border with the South. And of course, the peace process has been largely successful over the past 10 years with tensions going down. Could you see potential problems with the Northern Ireland outside the EU and the island of Ireland, of course, the Irish Republic, staying in?
Very definitely, yes. I see major problems. Even if Britain were to join the European Economic Area with Norway, which is the minimal thing that they would have to do to comply with the referendum, that would require, because the European Economic Area doesn't cover agriculture, it would require tariffs to be applied to food ingredients going from Northern Ireland to the Republic, or from the Republic of Ireland to the North, which is happening every day, all the time. And if we have to apply European tariffs to those, would be immensely complex. But even more seriously, it will drag the two parts of Ireland apart, make the nationalist community in Northern Ireland feel more isolated.
Do you think there's any chance of a do-over in terms of the UK? There's been a lot of headlines about it. The further they go along in the negotiation process, there might be buyer's remorse, or you don't see that happening?
I think it's going to be very difficult because we're going into a leadership election in the Conservative Party, and I think the candidates are going to be vying to prove to the party membership, which is very Europhobic, which of them is the most in favour of leaving the European Union. So I don't see the Conservative Party changing its mind and saying, well, look, we should have a second referendum. Perhaps the Labour Party could elect a leader who would take that view. I don't think so. I certainly don't see anything happening before another general election, or perhaps even two general elections. And in a way, it's going to take a while for the full negative consequences of Britain's decision to leave the European Union to be felt by the man and woman in the street in Britain. And it's only when they fully see and feel for themselves the downsides of leaving the European Union that they would be even ready to change their mind.
You're a big pro-European. How big of a test is this for the Union, and will it survive?
Oh, the European Union will survive. The European Union has survived far greater challenges than this, such as the euro crisis. And we have a number of countries like Serbia and Montenegro who are applying to join. We're not short of members, so to speak. I do think we have work to do. We have work to do to make the European Union even more democratic. It is a democratic union. Every decision is made by people who are either elected or have been chosen by an elected body. But we can make it more democratic by, for instance, having the President of the European Commission elected directly by the people. We need to complete the European digital single market so that we maximise the efficiency gains for Europeans of being together. And we need to complete the banking union so as to underpin the euro. A lot of work has been done in the last 2 or 3 years, under the radar almost, to strengthen the euro. But there's still more work to be done. And we must get on with our work. We must not find ourselves focusing only on Britain. We have other issues that have to be dealt with, other countries that have problems with which they need Europe's help, such as Italy and Greece. We can't simply focus on one country.
John Bruton, who thinks that Europe will march forward. Thank you very much. Former EU ambassador to the United States and, of course, former Prime Minister of Ireland. That's all we have time for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook, CCTV America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.